I am joined today on My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, joint program with Don't Worry About the Government podcast with Chris Novembrino of the aforementioned Don't Worry About the Government podcast. And boy, Chris, there really isn't much to talk about, is there?
I'm glad that you invited me on here so that we can raise awareness about a very important issue here today, Bruce. And that is something that's affecting millions of people across the country. Daylight savings time.
Daylight savings time.
When is this scourge going to end? Oh, yeah, and also the Democratic primaries. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so speaking of scourges, yes, I think that
yeah, another scourge that refuses to end.
I'm not a fan of the daylight saving. They got to change it. This is a modern time, and we gotta stop. Go Arizona, go other places where they've eliminated this. They're very smart because it's just I don't know. It just ruins everything. But I will say. We have had a very nice warm winter in the Northeast, and so I'm very eager to get out and, the possibility of early. Usually I have to wait till about the summer, but a friend of mine will go to Washington Square Park in New York and will bring out the guitars. So I'm getting primed and ready for it a little earlier than usual. I'm not as a skilled player as yourself, but, I can form a D chord or anything else with the that requires three-fingered strings.
I mean, this is definitely windows open season here in Texas. We're now having those 70-degree days, and I concur. There is nothing more fun than sitting out in the sun in this weather before it starts getting to be 80 and before all the bugs start coming out, and playing some guitar, and especially strumming some D chords. Nothing more soothing than a D chord.
Yeah, your now is like our June. And then we get the bugs too, who knows when they start coming, but they're always, hey, you know what, Mother Nature, has a way. And
yeah, they got a job to do. I appreciate that the bugs are out there doing an important thing. They're so gross, and I don't like them when they're on me.
No, definitely not. And a D chord does go against any negative feelings like that. A D chord is just followed by a G and a C, and that's probably there's probably the Bruce Carlson library of chords right there. But many a song crafted. I mean, you could do "Knocking on Heaven's Door" with that chord combo and things like that.
And don't forget to slide the D chord shape up and down the fretboard here too, because there's real good D chord shape action going on at 5 and 7 as well.
Start at 2. No, I do
bring it up to 5, bring it up to 7. Yeah.
A little bit of I'll do a little U2 with some still found I'm looking for with some action there in the multiple formations of the D.
We got to stop before I start bringing up the analog delay that I bought and how I was actually kind of thinking about the Edge's vibrato analog delay thing that's going on. I'm loving this analog delay, Bruce. But you didn't
awesome.
Have me on here to talk guitar, did you?
No. In
the old days, we definitely can.
The old days of radio, we used to, in my college radio station, we used to put two cart machines together and get an echo. And I used to do stuff like that.
Oh, that's awesome. That's like one of the best ways to generate echo, too. Especially if you can slide where the second tape reel is and actually have a little bit of a time adjustment. That's great.
Yeah, no, it was really, I always felt it was the best. It's like the Elvis Sun Records echo, where they used to just leave the door open to the basement. And they had these like big pipes down there and stuff, and it would just create a natural Sun Records echo that you can hear in all the, whether it's Orny Wheeler or Elvis Presley or any of them. It sounds really good. But no, yeah, we're not here to talk about echoes, although we could either keep that
we
in. We
definitely could. No, I think that will definitely stay in. But
at the end of the cast or something. But I think that I wanted to start with a historical statistic that I was working on just to frame things for people. And there's so much going on, but it frames this discussion. Okay, presidents up for election since 1900. There have been 20. McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Coolidge, Hoover, FDR, FDR again, Truman, Eisenhower, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, and Obama. That's 20. Only 5 out of the 20 have lost. re-election. Or
I
even
think this is a great way of framing it, because the default mode is Americans like to re-elect the president.
They like to keep them hired. They like to find a way. It's like, well, what a forgiving people we are. 75% since 1900. Now, someone might say, well, you're counting all FDRs. If you take the other two FDR out, you get about 68% since 1900. But I wouldn't even take them out because FDR's re-elects were just as challenging as anybody. Just happened circumstances in his favor. So just like any president. So Americans generally, yes, they've hired someone. They like to keep them. If anyone wants a glimmer of hope on the other side, if they're so inclined, the other factor is that been a while. In fact, I don't believe we've ever re-elected presidents for 2 terms 4 times in a row. So, right, Clinton, Bush, Obama, and here you would have Trump. So that hasn't happened. However, what negates that a bit is that trend is that presidents, have either died in office or decided not to run, like Truman.
Yeah, you got to throw Johnson in there, right?
Yep.
Like Johnson didn't run because he didn't think he was going to win.
Yeah, and very similar with Truman. He probably wanted to in 52, but no way, no path. And and he felt he was part of the problem. So he denied history of that stat. So when you take that out, so.
And 1912 with Taft is so weird because you have Roosevelt coming in and kind of splitting the Republican Party here, which opened up the door for Wilson. So does Wilson win in a head-to-head with Taft without Roosevelt entering in? So there's some things that fuzz it up, but we can easily say that way more than 50% of the time, Americans want to keep the incumbent.
Yeah, and it's about 75% because those factors you talk about are real, though. Like if you go with the Taft situation, so the other one to look at is when they lose. So those 5, a couple of things are in play. Either you could actually go with 2. Either their own parties are fractured or the economy is terrible for all of those losses. So the losses would be Taft, as we mentioned, Hoover, as we mentioned, Ford, Carter.
Yeah, Kennedy comes in and splits the vote with Carter, and Bush. Or you mean and Bush
2 was probably the weakest. Sorry, you're absolutely right. Bush 1. And that was probably the weaker one where the recession had actually started to tail off, but people didn't know it. That's what I think the consensus seems to be, is that it didn't matter if some economist, at Harvard could figure out that the recession was tailing a bit, because it wasn't like 1993 was that great. Clinton's first quarter as president, he gets like a 0.7 growth, which is almost negative, So it's those factors were present in those losses, which tells you a lot about when presidents lose. And you can say anything you want about President Trump, but the one factor that he seems to have control over is dissent within the party. You might argue that some of that is that people have left.
I think that is part of it. I think you're seeing some of that play out in the Democratic Party, right? I think that kind of fractious nature of the Democratic primary electorate, especially the split between the media, some of Never Trump, the all one word Never Trump, they have now kind of exerted some will inside of the Democratic field. And so that has kind of, I'm reminded of the Spinal Tap quote, where the band has become more selective. The audience has become more selective. That has created a smaller, more intense pool that has now really solidified around Donald Trump. I look at the example of Mitt Romney, right? He says that he's going to vote in favor of removal during Trump's impeachment trial, and now he's banned from CPAC.
Yeah, well, Romney is probably the only one that could kind of, quote, afford to do that, because I think this political situation in Utah is a little unique regarding Trump, where he didn't.
Justin Amash as well.
Yeah, in the House. Yeah, it was. So I think that it's a little unique where he could survive because Utah didn't exactly vote for Trump overwhelmingly. Doesn't mean, though, he hasn't faced a lot of pressure. So pressure politics are on, and you know people aren't like senators used to be really free actors most powerful people in Washington, and that's definitely declined in recent years, not just with this administration, but I would say probably since Bush. So when Clinton started, you had senators like Daniel Moynihan, which would get Clinton's bill and say, "Yeah, okay, that's nice. I'm the finance chair. We'll do what we want." So you didn't bring me into office. You narrowly won a presidential election against an incumbent. So that you see a big difference though now in Washington, where senators aren't. Yeah, they're still powerful people. Don't get me wrong. They still have tremendous privileges.
But the power in the parties is much more centralized, and that's true in both the Democratic Party and also the Republican Party. So to your point about what Donald Trump has done while in office here, most opposition voices have either, if you oppose the party too much, you have to leave the party like Justin Amash, or you become kind of a persona non grata like Mitt Romney. On the Democratic side, power has really consolidated away from the committee chairs, like the Jerry Nadlers of the world, or in yesteryear, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and has much more centered around Nancy Pelosi. And you saw a lot of that play out in the way that impeachment played out, because you had chairs of certain committees. Nadler was one. I also believe Elijah Cummings was another one. You've seen consolidation towards the Mitch McConnells and the Nancy Pelosi of the world, and the party has become much more centralized rather than the chairs actually really having their own spheres of influence.
I think that's true. Well, the House has always been that way. The House is a hierarchy. So you want the speakership, and then once you have it, there's very little power for the rest of the people. It's very much driven because of the Rules Committee. So it's not
right.
Just
you
the
can set the
there.
rules.
Yeah, you can set rules, and rules are wrapped around like an invisible force around each bill. So you have separate rules for how each bill is going to work. The Speaker picks 9 out of 13 members of the Rules Committee. So effectively, the Speaker's very, very powerful, even though Mitch McConnell has his powers. There are some things he can't do where an individual senator might have privileges. So it's not to say, every House member wants to be a senator, at a certain point. But it's not to say that they're not without their power. But the individual power has decreased a bit over time.
I think there's this point about party unity, and if you're worried about, as an incumbent, if you're worried about getting challenged and not winning re-election, one of the most important things you need to do, starting in 1912, but we see it all the way up to Jimmy Carter when he gets challenged by Kennedy in 1980, you also see it with Ford and Reagan challenging him, is you need to make sure that your House is unified, because if the House is split, your own internal House as the incumbent party, the outside challenge will overwhelm you. And so one thing you can certainly say that Trump has been very effective in doing is unifying his allies around him, and look at the way that he managed the primary process here to the point where Republicans simply didn't run primaries in certain states. That is a good solid centralization. It's a good example of a solid centralization of power.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And were it that it was all mechanics, like if that really were kind of a trick, I would say, well, that's not going to work. It's going to come through the seams, the opposition within the party. But that's not really the case. William Weld and Joe Walsh, for his limited run, didn't represent they're not getting enough votes. People like Kasich or Romney didn't want to run. Nobody serious started challenging. They didn't work fast enough or early enough to set up a challenge. And there's too many Republican fans that would attack anyone running in a primary. So I think that is a major box checked. And so it just frames my whole view of the election, having studied history for a while, is that, in elections like 2020, where there's a sitting president, are about the sitting president. And some of that gets ignored. They talk about it a little in the primaries. They talk about electability, but it gets ignored sometimes. And there's a talk about, well, what policies are we going to enact when we get there? It's like, well, you got to get there.
That's not the way you win the midterm election. I think the way you win the midterm election is it's a focused critique on the president, whoever they are at the time. And insofar as you're talking about yourself like a John Kerry was, especially later on in that campaign, you're losing. It needs to constantly be a critique of the executive branch.
When that election was focused on John Kerry was losing. Absolutely. When it was focused on John Edwards, they were when it was about Kerry, going goose hunting or riding the big parasail or what have you. He was not winning anything. It was when it was a critique of Bush. But it's also, I believe that it's less about what a candidate does and says when they're the challenger. Unfortunately, for those that like to see a strong challenge, this is just the way that I've observed it, with some exceptions. There's very little the challenger can do. It's kind of what you're really, and this shapes my whole view of what's going on with the landscape in 2020. It's really going to be a very close thing. It's actually favoring incumbent, and what you're hoping for is if you're hoping to unseat Trump, is a very narrow win, possibly even a reverse of 2016, where it's an electoral college win by getting the Michigan and Pennsylvania back and winning Wisconsin, or coming up with other states that add up to Wisconsin, because I do think Wisconsin will be a tough one. Then again, it's something that Democrats have won recently. So
no, we'll debate a little bit on the electoral college map here in a second, because I've got some thoughts on that too. What I will say is, going back to the nature of how does the incumbent defend the seat, right? I think for the incumbent, what you want to then do is make, if you're Donald Trump, you want to make this election about Joe Biden or about Bernie Sanders. And so for a Democratic voter, my advice would generally be try to actually think about what the strongest, and by strongest I mean most salient and most resonant critique of your candidate is going to be, whoever your preferred candidate is going to be, and try to war game for that, because that is the strategy. What George Bush did in 2004 against John Kerry is the correct strategy for dealing with an incumbent critique. Similarly, I think really the only thing that the challenger can do, either Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders, is centralize the narrative for the critique against the executive branch. I think the big policy promises, not just given the makeup of Congress and how it's not going to be the easiest place to get things done after the election, but I think talking about big policy promises actually opens yourself up more for critique, which is exactly what you don't want to do if you want to win this thing that has a less than 50% likelihood of happening.
Yeah, I think it's really contrary to what most people think, to what, say, most Democrats think, to what most social media commentary is that it's about their
policies
plans
that matter. Right. We got to talk about the policies. I support this candidate or that candidate because of the policies. I mean, my preferred candidate who's no longer in the race, or many of my preferred candidates who are no longer in the race, I supported them because of policies. But that's actually not what would get them into the White House. It would be by sustaining a narrative critique on Donald Trump that is resonant with a wide swath of people, especially independents.
Yeah. So the last time that the last most recent defeats of incumbents were, the last three, let's take. So you had Bush won, the Papa Bush by Clinton, and let's take Carter and Reagan 1980 and Ford Carter 1976. Ford Carter, I'm going to kind of X out for a second, because Jimmy Carter is no example of how to run a general election campaign. Very nearly lost the thing. Very close, had a lot of stumbles running, although I guess it does play into the bit of the idea of he didn't keep it enough about Ford. It started to get about Carter in the summer going into the election, and he made a lot of stumbles. He did this disastrous Playboy interview, which for somebody from, I think I know what he's kind of trying to do, because...
Well, what's he trying to do in this Playboy interview? I don't know about this.
Well, I think we think we're in the modern times, and we don't realize that in the 1970s, they also thought the same thing. And he was trying to do something new and modern. Like, he was a Christian Southern Baptist and Sunday school teacher, etc., and known for his kind of conservatism within the Democratic Party. And so he did an interview with this kind of risque new audience, and to show that he could reach out. I mean, to the extent that there was even thought about it, because it was probably the dumbest thing in the world to do. But it was really what he said in the interview more than the when that came out, and there was things about having lust in his heart and things like that. I think he felt it was an early attempt at authenticism.
Yeah, no, I think that's real, but that's a bad way to be real.
But that's just one of mistakes. So there was another mistake where he said he wanted to help people, and he wanted to increase taxes on everyone who was rich. But then in a second follow-up question, he ended up inadvertently defining that as what would turn out to be, he gave some number, income value, that would turn out to be 75% of Americans. So it was pretty far from a tax on the 1%. So he made these mistakes. Then he criticized Lyndon Johnson, and people were like, he's trying to win Texas, and that was bad. So he made these series of gaps and really just bled through the entire 76 general campaign, hoping it would end and hoping he would just, win a narrow one. And of course, the debate helped where Ford had his gaffe. But again, it's usually about the incumbent failing and not having confidence and people losing confidence in them. And I hate to say it for those that might think otherwise, there is an element of we are the Greek chorus. The gods are going to, throw the thunderbolts as they will. You win an election like that if you're challenging an incumbent, if there's a particular failure that's obvious and on its face. And so far we've seen like political failures, like not holding the party together. You're not going to win when you got a Ted Kennedy, who's a major Democrat, attacking Carter. And it was also Jerry Brown in 1980. So you had kind of a double threat, and he was never super popular among Democrats anyway, establishment Democrats, Carter.
And George H.W. had Ross Perot, which was essentially kind of a flanking thing, because so much of Perot's narrative, yes, he had bipartisan appeal, but his narrative was centered on the national debt, which is kind of more inherently a conservative issue, and was very much a critique against Bush's version of governance.
And one thing, absolutely, I agree. It was a place to go for disaffected GOP. I don't think, there's a lot of mathematically, I think Clinton probably would have won without Perot, but certainly it certainly sped things up.
It's a sign. I look at these challenges like the Kennedys, the Reagan in 76, Perot in 92, their presence and the fact that these figures meaningfully exist. Also, don't forget about Pat Buchanan. Those things are signs of a weakness of the incumbent that I think are useful. And so if you look at Trump now, he's facing some of those things. He's kind of moving into a 1992-ish scenario. Yeah, he had weak primary challengers, but they were there in a meaningful way that Bush didn't have. The economy, as we're taping this right now, like the Dow Jones has been going downwards in a serious way, wiping out a couple of years of gains.
Yeah, I think you gotta stick with GDP and unemployment for a real assessment. But yeah, it's the coronavirus, and that could cause those fundamental problems.
And that is causing concern too. I mean, you look at the coronavirus. Here's the thing. You can say that people are overreacting to the news, and that the news and the media likes to take things. I remember way back when you and I first met, back in the time, this was like shark attack time. If you remember, every summer we used to have like a rash of shark attacks that would break out mysteriously in August, and then people would come out, scientists, and go like, look, there is definitely nothing to this. This is just an over-exaggeration. There's a little bit of that going on, shark attack summer with the coronavirus, but this is also a real problem. You're seeing governments around the world having herky-jerky responses, just to kind of keep it generalized here. And it is definitely having an effect on the average American. Everything from the we're fighting over toilet paper videos that you're seeing online to I just went to the grocery store today, Bruce, my own grocery store, and as I was leaving, with like right as I was getting the coffee to tape the show, I just asked, I was like, hey, how are you guys stocked on like hand sanitizer? And she's like, oh, we're completely out of that, and we're completely out of masks. This is a thing that is on the average voter's mind in a way that I think is being underappreciated right now. And perhaps by election day, that dissipates. But this is the type of mass black swan event that can completely color an election, the same way that the financial crash in September of 2008 colored the election for the rest of October all the way to November.
That's a great point to make. We should remember that about 2008. Everyone remembers this Obama landslide, and he was probably going to find a way to win. But that was not the case. Before the crash, Palin actually added some points coming, and their convention they got a huge boost, McCain and Palin, out of the convention. And it was a very tough election up until the crash just made it an obvious thing. Harold Wilson, the prime minister of Great Britain, famous line from him is, events, dear man, events. That's what determines a prime ministership and a presidency, too. So these events come, and this is certainly, you couldn't get a better example of one. So a couple of thoughts to get into it a little bit. The COVID-19, I think I am a person who is a little bit on the side of, it's not helpful. Our news and our politics are not helpful. The institutions we have are not helpful in this situation. It's gotten all political, and the news coverage and trying to sell ads. Nothing annoys me more, Chris, than clicking on a coronavirus article and then getting a paid promotion like, please sign up and to subscribe. It's like, if you're going to give news about a public health like that better darn be like, above the paywall. Like, that is ridiculous. I'm seeing, but it makes it also makes the point obvious to me about what's going on, is that all of our media is based on clicks more than ever before. It was always based on ratings. I get it, but that's a more general thing. It's based on very specific, like, articles have to get clicks. It is in much greater interest to scare than to inform, even though there are some things informing. It's a very bad virus, don't get me wrong. Seems to have an
but there's a feedback loop going on here. I agree. I keep hearing the FDR quote of, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, which is, I know we all know it, but it's a really underappreciated wisdom. And I think it's particularly applicable to COVID-19. The fear of governmental responses being critiqued, starting with China, rippling all the way to Italy, and of course our own government. They're all scared of being seen as doing a bad job, so they've fudged the numbers. People are scared of getting the disease. Rightfully so. I understand it. This looks like it has a much higher mortality rate than the flu does. To go into Rumsfeldian terms here, we've got a lot of known knowns, we got a lot of unknown knowns, we got unknown unknowns, and I forgot one. But the point is that to really make it Bush administration style.
I don't miss him, but I miss his quotes.
No, he has great quotes. But I think that's also actually relevant here. That's what loads into the fear matrix. And I'm much more worried about the fear. And I think, if you're thinking about the elections, how much does this fear about COVID-19 still linger come election day? Does it dissipate miraculously, as some have prognosticated? Or is it something that is still kind of making its way through the world over the next 6 to 12 months? It could be either or.
I don't think you have to answer it with epidemiology, say. I think it could be answered politically, that whether it is or not, it will be baked into the cake by then. But it certainly wasn't helpful. So when I say events, dear man, events, this is exactly what Harold Wilson was talking about. And I don't think, look, I'm going to say, I don't know how any particular president reacting to it would be good. It's a very difficult thing, infectious diseases, and the way that they can travel so quickly, and they're hard to reckon with. But certainly there's criticism of the response. Some of that might have happened with any group. but it does go to the president's ability to portray confidence. And I guess my one thought about it is Ronald Reagan would have had some story about World War II and a Marine who faced, and we don't know what's over that trench, sir, but we're going to find it. Something like that. And
right. We got to face this with great resolve. I think, the difference between Reagan and Trump, just the one difference, is that I think Reagan in his rhetoric has an ability to assuage concerns and calm fears. And you saw that exhibited throughout his presidency. He was faced with many dramatic and traumatic events, and his team and his personal delivery created calm and reassurance. And people who really like Reagan, they point to that. And I don't think that that's a thing that people can make the same case for with Donald Trump's presidency and his speechwriting team. They have not seemed to have that same ability to create calm and reassurance.
Now, I have to add, though, I have to say that we also got to look at the change. So Ronald Reagan makes a speech. It's at 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock, a quick snippet at the news, which he was expert at, making a speech that would have a sliceable part at 6 and 11. And that's what you're seeing. Now we face both the kind of 24-hour, literal 24-hour, not just cable blaring 24 hours, but everyone checking their phones every second for the new statement, right? And then also people having their own channels. So
absolutely.
We'll make no bones about it. We're not exactly on the right wing side of things. So there's a lot of media we're not always checking. Sometimes I'll check things out of just a desire to span my media knowledge of what people are saying. But it's also a matter of how is it playing for, let's say, 45% of the population. That might be, if it's that high, that might be looking at a different kind of media than just the TV itself. But I do perceive that, on the TV, just making speech is very different. Reagan Trump is a. I just want to really quick point out, because once we invoke Reagan Trump, I think there's comparison and contrast. So I think some things are close. Like approval ratings weren't always high for him. Everyone thinks about it like it was super high, but in 82, he was pretty close to these like 45, 49%, terrible economy, one of the worst recessions. And also here's the real similarity there. If you want to compare, both presidents are very different kinds of presidents, and it was definitely seen that way. I have a Bruce Springsteen quote from a concert in 1980, which is almost identical to his quote, to quotes that he's made in 2016, after both elections. And it's like, I don't know what to think about this election, so there was a reaction at the time, so that's the compare and contrast.
I like that you brought up quotes, because that was the other thing I was thinking about, is we're now moving into the part of the political calendar in the presidential cycle. We're not quite there yet, but we're moving into what I call quote season, where one quote becomes a frame for the rest of the election. Whether it's John McCain saying the fundamentals of the economy are strong, my friends, or Mitt Romney talking about the 47%. This is
Roanoke, Obama.
Yeah. Kerry had one. This. Yes, you didn't build this. Yes, exactly. And that becomes a narrative matrix. I think the potential danger here with COVID-19 is that Trump creates some sort of soundbite around this that becomes a matrix to understand the response.
But the disease will be baked into the cake by the time you get into October, I think.
I agree, but when you say baked into the cake, that also could mean pricing down. You can say something that hurts your numbers, like saying you didn't build that didn't help Obama.
Oh yeah, but it won't be a singular factor in the election. I think that's a safe prediction to make. It just merely, look, it would never be good for any Republican administration to have a healthcare issue. Healthcare is not there. If the issue's on healthcare, favors Democrats. If the issue's on war, a Democrat can try. It's going uphill for a Democrat. And you can try to be Bill Clinton and say, well, Slobodan Milosevic, I can fight a war too kind of thing, but it's not what you're ever going to be seen for. You're going to win that election based on the economy or some kind of democratic healthcare, democratic issue, Social Security, whatever it is. If you're Republican, and the issue and anything forces the issue to be healthcare, how can you be when generally they're not in favor of spending a lot in that direction, at least trying to trim where it can be trimmed, in terms of healthcare, not wanting anything large or broad or new programs. So not to say that they're not going to, obviously, legislation for billions of dollars for coronavirus passes immediately.
I believe that they moved a $9 billion bill through. But to your point, there was some division in the Republican Party over moving that. But I think, the two forces going on there are fiscal conservatism versus trying to win an election. And trying to win an election overrode fiscal conservatism.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and it will. It will. And with an issue like this.
Yeah. And should if you're trying to win an election.
Yeah, $9 billion isn't approaching the type of revolutionary change in healthcare that Democratic candidates would like, for instance. So it puts you a little on the back foot. So you don't want healthcare to be an issue, but there will be other things that I think this is really, you could look at this election as complicated it is. It could be as simple as the thing goes to the last couple of weeks and either, there's some event that Trump doesn't do well, or there's an event that he happens to do well with, and the thing goes to Wisconsin. Wisconsin decides by a hair in one direction or the other. And, all the talk and the Buttigieg and the Sanders and the Klobuchars and even what Trump's been talking about and coronavirus and all of this comes down to nothing. It comes down to a week in October. November, I should say. And
no, I agree. Or a week in September. I'm thinking a lot about hurricane season, particularly given his response to the hurricane that hit Puerto Rico. Hurricane season usually starts in September. And so this is a thing that is not like a national issue. We don't debate hurricane response the rest of the other 3.5 years. However, I do think that hurricane response can affect the way things play out in Florida and the way things play out in North Carolina, which I'm on 270 to win right now. Those are both listed as battleground states as well. And so, one thing I will say is anyone who thinks that there's a certitude that Trump or whoever the Democratic nominee is going to just move right to the White House, they should be cognizant of black swan events changing the entire arc of the election. Because 2008, I go back to this a lot, it was all about Obama as a constitutional law professor. Some of the oversteps as perceived by the Democratic Party, by the Bush administration, particularly centered around the Patriot Act and how that expanded out war powers authorities, and to a certain extent, a discussion around healthcare. And then after the middle of September in 2008, it was all about how are we going to stabilize the economy and who has the best vision for stabilizing the economy as the stock market is on tilt. And it's John McCain's quote about the fundamentals of the economy are strong, overwhelming the "you didn't build that" quote.
And one thing, and it did, yeah. The Roanoke thing didn't really stick as well, and he also had Romney making his own mistake about the who was in
47%, the makers and the takers.
Yeah. So I think, and those things can happen in the fall in either direction. Where we'll get into it later, but we're probably heading towards like a double gaff maker situation. Who makes the first gaff? Rocky II.
Those are also black swan events.
Whoever gets up, whoever can make the last gaff wins. You're not going to have there's no James Comey to save you this time. But before I get into all that silliness, which is very attractive to get into, I think that I wanted to make one point again about the challenging party when people are looking to the party that's not in power in the White House, and what history kind of shows you a bit is that what you want to do is the most recent examples are 1980, 1992, and then you bring up one where it wasn't against an incumbent president, but it's 2008 as well, where at least you were trying to take out an incumbent party, is that you have to act as if So that from the moment of nomination or even before, you have to become the president of the United States. You have to start issuing statements from your desk on every world event. You have to start being in front of podiums. If you have a governor's mansion or you have some official place to be from, this was Clinton. Clinton did this very well, where a lot of the statements were from Little Rock. But to the point about 2008, there's a good witness to this. It's somewhat objective, right? Between how the Democrats and Republicans handled this is George W. Bush. So unlike I don't think most people have, I read his Decision Points book. It's actually an interesting book to read. He focuses just on, rather than writing his own life story, which would have been boring, they always turn out boring. He wrote on just certain decisions that he made, and one of them was to support a bailout of the TARP legislation. But he talks about how McCain. He had a meeting at the White House. Both candidates were summoned. Both minority leaders in the House and Senate, and majority leaders in the House and the Speaker of the House were summoned, and Obama and McCain were both there. And Bush talks about how Obama was a leader of the Democrats and had ideas and realized the scope of the problem, where McCain just did not and was still trying to negotiate kind of like Hail Mary type things and not really keeping his eye on, and he couldn't tell if he was for TARP or not up until the last minute. And all of these things that exhibited to him, he's highly critical of McCain in the situation, and how, given the direness of what was going on at the end of his presidency, that he really felt, which I guess some of that has happened, that, my God, he was going to become Herbert Hoover, George W. Bush, because his own party wouldn't take this action. So I guess the larger point there is act as if you're the candidate, you become president. Trump did this, in 2016. I knew the moment that I saw him behind a podium pointing out reporters and selecting reporters. And we saw less of that from Clinton. Clinton would make statements in a different way. You act as if. It gives you the best chance of winning. It doesn't guarantee anything.
270 to win, just real quickly to reframe us here, has Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona listed as the pure battleground states. So I keep thinking, if you're Joe Biden, you're a nominee, you're focusing on Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, and that is actually enough, according to the math here, to get them across the finish line. But I do think that the Democrats need to put a lot of energy into Florida. But if you're doing that, you have to go in there almost overwhelming, like you're fully committed to winning Florida.
Yeah, well, I don't think elections are won on the. I know what you're saying, of course, and that's what campaign strategy and the like. But I'm more of that, like, hey, if you want to win, do something. Do something. In effect, you kind of like you have to take some kind of action that would change the dynamics of the election, not just spend more money. I mean, yes, all of that's important. Of course, if you're not doing that, if you're not door knocking and you're not doing things like that, you're not going to win a state. But the parties are pretty even in their weapons in that regard. We have a very mobilized bases on both sides in this election. So you get that kind of 2004 feel going in where it's really close. Ties are going to the incumbents. I say go into the incumbents like I'm not talking about 100-year arc of history, but if you look at the races where a president was really tight and the president wasn't that popular, and so I'd go with George W. Bush, Truman, and Wilson. President wins ties. The incumbent wins the tie. Like you, if they're just kind of unpopular, but there hasn't been this one particular thing you can pin on them that's huge, or the economy's not that bad. Wilson had a 1914 recession and was starting to recover with purchases made by Europe for World War I in 1916. Wins a narrow one. People are a little afraid of the war. There's some issues on his side. Truman, same thing, wins a narrow one. George W. Bush wins a narrow one. So it's you have that to look at. because in all those elections, I guess what's relevant to 2020 is both sides felt good about their bases and felt that they were mobilized.
Yeah, this is very much going to be about energizing and mobilizing independent voters, for the Democrats in particular, into thinking it's time for a change. And for Republicans, similarly, to make those independents feel as though, why go out and vote on election day? Things aren't that bad.
Yeah, that's what you definitely, of course, you're always looking to do those type of things. But talk about taking an action, talk about challengers, like act as if, start building your model White House. I mean, don't exactly go full Aaron Sorkin and have a real model White House. That would be weird. But find a place to find some authority zone, issue statements, react to world events, act as if you're the president, do whatever control you have over anything, even if it's as little as, well, I've been in close consultation with Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, and we're awarding, this amount. We have a bill pending for this amount to this flood-ravaged area. Why wait? And don't always.
Yeah.
I think Democrats tend to be the revolutionaries, so we always run as like we're outside going in, and that's probably the wrong way to do it in a race for an executive position.
No, I think if you're Joe Biden and you're the nominee, I think after you get the nomination, you start making meetings with world leaders that and have lots of good presidential, normal-looking world leader meetings. In particular, if you can have those kind of programmed to contrast against Trump's sometimes awkward meetings with world leaders and have kind of a juxtaposition there that serves as its own soft form of critique, as you're saying, with issuing statements. Issue statements and make sure those statements are constructed and written as a form of critique of the incumbent. Like, these are the right strategies. I think similarly, if Sanders gets the nomination, he needs to be looking at another strategy like that, where he's meeting with world leaders and showing that as president, he can assuage the naysayers and rise to the occasion and not have, when you were describing McCain, I get very, very similar vibes to maybe the critique of Sanders' ability to lead at a presidential level. McCain serves as a really good critique of the Republican Party, but maybe not so good as a leader of the Republican Party. I think that's maybe a concern that some people have with Sanders. Great at critiquing the way the Democratic Party has worked and the Democratic Party establishment, maybe does not have the ability to pull all the levers. Well, if you're Bernie Sanders and you need to assuage those concerns, you need to start meeting with world leaders, you need to start issuing statements and really create this presidential aura around you.
So what I would do, and this is like so exactly that, and I do believe while he'd be challenged, if Sanders were to receive the nomination, so a Bernie Sanders would have to counter the stereotypes that might be coming. And I think that the weapons available to do that, if I were he, and I don't think Bruce Carlson of the podcast will be consulted, but you never know, would be to work through the House. That's the one Democratic lever of power, to ask Nancy Pelosi to please present a bill, and to do that quickly, because upon assuming that nomination, whoever it is, and it's more so for Bernie Sanders if he were to happen to get it, much more so for him because Biden's already been VP, right? You are now the most important person in to the press. I mean, Trump is almost old. No, he's just the president. But we've been hearing from him since 2015, right? Bernie Sanders now becomes the most important person. It would be the same if it was Buttigieg or if it was Klobuchar or whoever, because they now have the nomination of a major party and can conceivably win. So use that leverage, because people are going to be looking for things if they think you have a chance of becoming president. You go to the speaker and say, please put my education bill. What bill can you agree with? If we can't agree on health care, if that's too big, put my education bill, put my student loan bill on the docket right now, pass a bill from the House, or at least put it into the House.
I'm already getting things passed. I'm not even president yet.
Exactly. And then world leaders gets tricky. Some don't want to meet with you. Do what you can on that front. Maybe go visit places. Make sure that you're speaking. I think like Sanders in particular needs to educate America about his foreign policy. because he's so much focused on the other side of things. Make sure you're reacting to any with a plan to any statements that have. But one of the things that Kennedy did was at a certain point, after he did well in the debates, he got 7 Southern governors who hadn't supported him to then support him. Now, how did he do it? It's one of two things. Either they saved it, they kind of sandbagged it for a while. These guys were going to support him as the Democratic nominee, but we're holding off. And maybe Joe Kennedy said, hey, wait, don't endorse my son yet, or they really didn't want to endorse Kennedy and then after the debate performance decided to do so. But in any way, that's one thing you could do. Sanders lined up with all the Democratic governors and things like this will help you campaign. But
sure. I have a question for you. Has there ever been a president that has won re-election where their favorable and unfavorable ratings have been upside down through the duration of their presidency? Because it's looking like Donald Trump might be going into Election Day upside down.
I'm not sure about the measurement of unfavorability over time. What I do have is the Gallup poll, and you have people like, Truman was pretty far down there, but Truman peaked at the right time. I mean, that's what I've heard of political scientists say, is that basically you couldn't have rolled the dice at a better time for Truman. He peaked right in the October of 1948, right when pollsters stopped polling and then had Dewey 5 points up. Well, with a margin of error, that's like 2 points up. And margin of error was even probably a little larger in those days. So I don't know about the consistent polling. I know right track, wrong track has only been asked since like the 70s. I don't know about unfavorability, but
that's a fundamental that does seem to favor the challenger. I'll just put it that way.
That's so hard to predict now, though. That could change the week before the election. That's the issue with those things, is that
it could
just a poll. Yeah, I think that's what happened with George. I think George W. Bush ran out the didn't run the clock, the reverse of that. I think he wanted that election right when it happened. A few months later, and it might have been Kerry's. He was getting more unpopular, and the war in Iraq was getting more unpopular each month. It reached 50-50 at the time of the Democratic convention. So those polls, and Kerry, by the way, had a pro-war policy, so it wasn't like he could really benefit from that enough anyway. And there were a sizable percentage of people who were against the war that voted for Bush, and not a huge, but 10%, which is crazy. But when you think about it, there were 2 pro-war candidates, so he didn't benefit as much of that from it that he could. So these poll things can change. But I would just say the Wilson, Truman, George W. Bush are your examples in history for winning incumbents. I mean, people like Carter, it was right up to the wire if you followed the press in 1980. And if you followed the polls, there were a lot of people saying Carter could beat Reagan. And it really came like a couple weeks before the election, and Carter had a lot of problems. Now, same with Ford. Ford was doing very well the last 2 weeks. So that was one where Carter wanted the election when it happened, because if it happened a week later, Ford would have won. Well, let's just take the results of the Democratic primary so far, and I have to say, the timing of it is awfully retro in that 2 candidates by March. Wow, that's like you didn't even have that in 1976. So it's like it's become a kind of, we thought this big like monster of 23 candidates and new people getting in during the race, and a couple of billionaires and all these wild cards, and Andrew Yang and who's almost a phenom in and of himself, like, is just turned into 2 candidates by the beginning of March. And
well, you brought up peaking at the right time, and I think that is very much the story of the Biden campaign, right? They were at one point, and they ran presumptively as the front runner. I think the last time you had me on, we talked about the Biden strategy of essentially hiding the candidate, up to and including keeping the candidate from an interview with Rachel Maddow, which I think most Democratic strategists would say is ill-advised. But the Biden campaign ran with this strategy, And it worked out for them because they were essentially able to be not the focus of a lot of these discussions while remaining the front runner. And then you had consolidation of many of the other moderate candidates rolled into Joe Biden. They did that big endorsement availability. And after they did that, I think it's kind of game, set, match now. It's kind of academic.
Yeah, and a similar thing, I've been studying the 1988 election. We had a series, you break everybody's back, two-parter on that, which involved a lot in that Democratic primary election. But the major factor was that Dukakis won the nomination, where nobody in the beginning really had Dukakis winning, because he was just a little better than the others in most of the contests. He had a little bit more money, but mostly because Super Tuesday is a giant flood and the other candidates drowned. I mean, that's really what it is. Gephardt, who had just come out of a win in Iowa, should have normally got the news. If you follow that Jimmy Carter model, Gephardt should have been the surprise candidate that wins New Hampshire and then does well in the rest of the states. But he didn't. First of all, he had some money issues. Second of all, his message was a little bit very kind of like Trump-like message, about Rust Belt and factories and also trade and things like that, talking about South Korea not buying enough of our cars, and while we're buying theirs and things like that, presenting, a very much unfairness argument. Wins Iowa. But the real factor was he goes to Super Tuesday and two things happen. One is when he's going to like Palm Beach, older condos and things like that with some New York retirees. And it's like they're all for Dukakis already. They have Dukakis hats on when he goes to speak. But the second thing was when he's in Tennessee or he's in Georgia, it's not like Iowa. They don't know what a candidate's doing there. Why are they there? There's so many states voting at once that there's this giant flood and you can't really get traction, and you need a lot of money to win those big states, or you have to have name recognition already. And that's what happened to Klobuchar and Buttigieg. And in the end, that's I think, Biden was just kind of a sleeper candidate there that needed a push, got the push, and then he's the VP and everybody knows his name. Bloomberg, I think that those attempts to buy the election like that, he just falls into history with other attempts. It didn't,
It's an interesting study in the sense of there were 1.69 million real people who went out on Super Tuesday and voted for Michael Bloomberg. It's also interesting, as a footnote, in the fact that Bloomberg was serving as a heat sink to Joe Biden, and Joe Biden still performed well on Super Tuesday. A lot of people talk about the debate on whether Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were splitting each other's votes, but people always forget in that debate that Bloomberg was really drawing some of the votes that would otherwise be going to Joe Biden on Super Tuesday. And it is interesting that you can flood the airwaves and get that many overnight supporters on, let's charitably call it, a limited platform. Just name recognition.
Yeah, I look at that like it goes to show you, like, when people say, oh, he has a lot of money, he could buy a lot of commercials. What commercials? I saw some of them. I mean, they weren't very good.
There was nothing to them. They were just everywhere.
Yeah, you got to do something. You have to either do something rhetorically, that's possible, make a policy pronouncement that's shocking and big, or you have to or get an endorsement that's significant, like Joe Biden did, at least significant in South Carolina, or as Biden did with getting two of his major challengers to turn and support him. That's a huge event, and it's those events in politics that do so much more. The commercials, sure, you got to have enough money to run, or else you're going to get swamped, but having the money doesn't work the other way. And you're absolutely right about that. I think that he was taking away from Biden, and Biden was still winning. I think it shows that so Biden, is it about excitement? it's not. I don't think that's it. It's not about a revolution. It's about a kind of
It's a return to
well,
normalcy.
we're normalcy. We know this guy. This is the way that he's usually run. It's you got the Amtrak Joe factor. A little bit of he's from Scranton. He's from Pennsylvania. He, as a Delaware senator, he was in the Philly market. He's known in Pennsylvania. He's been vice president, so he's known. Although that doesn't always get you the presidency, as we know, and that's going to be a hard fight. It's going to be a really hard election. But it's every possibility that either Biden or Sanders or Warren, if she had continued to run, could conceivably win this one. There's no doubt. It's not guaranteed either way. It's just a real tough fight. And the null hypothesis, as we used to say in statistics classes, incumbent wins. So the reason I'm not naming the incumbent is that would bring up too much. So we have a very special incumbent in this election, which might change those type of theories. But when I just look at history and the swath of history, people don't like to fire who's in there unless they really, really things change and they want to. So,
well, I think more broadly, too, for the progressive wing of the party here, epitomized by the Warren and Sanders voters, one of the challenges that they were facing going into this is, one, the very large field and making sure you can consolidate a dominant vote share in a large field. And then later on, especially as Biden is established as the frontrunner, there are big differences between Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton. I would argue in the case of Hillary Clinton, there are people in the country who intensely dislike Hillary Clinton in sort of a unique way, and you see that borne out statistically. And I don't think that tracks with Joe Biden's experience. I think, if anything, Joe Biden has been viewed in a much more favorable light, especially when you contrast her to Hillary Clinton. The idea of Bernie Sanders as the protest candidate to Hillary Clinton makes some sense, and it actually has a lot of appeal to people who maybe aren't necessarily inclined towards Bernie Sanders and his fondness, especially for the term socialism, but many of the tenets of socialism. I think Bernie Sanders was viewed as a protest candidate in 2016. This time around, he has to run on his own merits because Joe Biden is viewed by a lot of people just in a much more favorable light than Hillary Clinton is.
Yeah, there was, and you could make a guess. You could make a scenario, let's say, where all 2016 was about was there was some latent dislike of Hillary Clinton, and if it wasn't dealt with properly, it probably could have been dealt with better. In Michigan and Pennsylvania, it wasn't dealt with well enough. They just kind of ran this above the air campaign, and that factored in, and all you got to do is reverse it and you win. I mean, Trump never won a majority, he won a plurality. There were a lot of there was Gary Johnson and Jill Stein and a lot of write-ins, just two unpopular candidates by all the polls, so that you could make that case that hey, you go in there, you just change the picture, and you pick up this thing. I'm not even. I put it out there without knowing if I agree with that theory. That theory is possible. I think though, when someone becomes an incumbent, they're an incumbent, so that you can't take that out of the race. It's not simply a rematch of 2016. But there's the possibility that that's just what it was. There's just this factor. And
I think that goes
right
back to
wrong,
2008. You see Barack Obama get the nomination over Hillary Clinton, and she was assumed to be a very strong frontrunner going into that campaign as well. And I think that people were, yes, they were interested in Barack Obama's story. Yes, he had a rock star appeal to him. He was a great orator. He was driving big crowds at the rallies. People were very excited to get out and vote for Barack Obama. But I also think that he served as a foil and a contrast and a protest vote to Hillary Clinton. So I think we've seen a lot of at the ballot box data to suggest that there's something about Hillary Clinton as a candidate that is different than Joe Biden. Although we haven't seen Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. This is the first time, really, that we've seen Joe Biden have to get weathered.
He's been attacked, but he hasn't been the full cannons haven't been on him because that always happens in a primary. You don't know where to aim. I think President Trump signaled who he was wanting to run. Actually said it directly that he wanted to face Sanders, to the extent you can trust anything he's saying, because he says this and then he says something else.
One
tomorrow.
might argue that the whole contact with the Ukraine thing was about Joe Biden, though.
Yeah, and it wouldn't have mattered if they changed, right? Because it's to affect a Democratic primary, because you can affect it in three ways. You can get the candidate out and have another candidate that you want to run against. Bingo. There's all the evidence that Nixon did that in 72. He didn't want to face Muskie. He wanted to face McGovern, and he got it. So that's one way. Or you can have rather than getting the person to leave the race, you just can have another person surge and beat that person in the primary, and you're still affecting the Democratic primary. Or you can have the person get the nomination, but they're weakened by all the dirty tricks and attacks and things that happened that you kind of did as from the other party. So either way you win. So it's always a strategy for enterprising political consultants and campaigns to sort of think about the other party's primary. I mean, it's not the most ethical thing to do, but it's trying to affect that is if you get caught doing it, then it's bad. And that's, Nixon came close to that being known in 72, that, some of that was dirty tricks, putting fake letters on the campaigns attacking each other when no one really sent the letter. It came out of Nixon's operation. So, I mean, he signaled who he wanted. Sanders, it's a small group now of the Democratic Party that support him. The key is if you're a Democrat, if you're the Democratic Party, you have to find a way to keep that coalition alive. Democrats always win with a coalition. And there's long been challenges on the left. Jerry Brown was still continuing to run against Bill Clinton in 92. He didn't. And Clinton had to keep that left on his side. So you'll always have that. Democrats are a coalition party. Republicans have their coalition too, but they won't win without those Sanders voters. It's a good 25, 30, 35%. So they have to find a way to do this, or Sanders, in a surprise, I don't see it with the states coming up, but in a surprise, gets the nomination. And then and there's winnable plays in all of those scenarios. Sanders, I believe, follow the old Nixon adage, whether he would do it or not. You run a primary, one way, and then you run a general election the other. You go a little bit more to the center running in that general. And somebody like a Sanders could still pull off a win, Yeah, they're going to attack him socialist. And you could be like, this is ridiculous. You know what I'm doing. It's democratic socialism. And
yeah, there's two different ways for them to run as nominees. I think if you're Sanders, you're trying to energize the I just want a change of pace voter. The independent voter, I actually think, is kind of counterintuitively a little bit more available to Sanders to mobilize. Joe Rogan America, if you will. The type of person who likes the Joe Rogan podcast, likes seeing things kind of get shaken up a little. I think with Joe Biden, the difference with him is he's not going to be able to court Joe Rogan America, but I think there's a more stable down ballot strategy for Joe Biden where you just focus on getting people energized and turned out for those down ballot races and hope that when they go there to vote for down ballot candidates, that also obviously ripples upward as well. I think Biden's strategy, sort of obviously here, is more conventional. Sanders is trying to find parts of the electorate that maybe feel less spoken for to compensate for, I think, some of maybe the more reliable votes that he might be losing along the way here.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent analysis of exactly what's going on. You're not the Republicans after Goldwater, the RNC issued a memo that said we're no longer going to try to create a new party to win an election. And I think that that could be the criticism here. Now, one could say, well, Bruce, but the RNC did that in 2016. They really didn't. Trump won utilizing the the car in the garage, so to speak. I mean, those were regular GOP voters selecting the GOP candidate, and many, good percentage, almost 10%, like didn't like who they were pulling the lever for, but they weren't going to go with the Democrat. And then some did. Some Republicans, certain groups of women, for instance, did actually go with Hillary Clinton, despite whatever political disagreements they might have. So it wasn't entirely built out of just those Trump fans, just kind of people with the MAGA on the Twitter that won the GOP election. It's an important factor. And so Sanders has that issue to face. Like you say, I like how you put it, that the best argument for him is that it's not so much I'm going to bring my crowd that you see behind me in the rallies, but I can appeal to this independent group who normally don't vote. And that's going to depend on how he speaks to his issues, and how he explains it to people, and how he comes off as a general election candidate.
Yeah, change. It's Obama's framing of hope and change, really smart, not because of the hope, but because of the change thing. Because there are a lot of single issue voters who vote on something that's a modified version of vote all the bums out. I'm going to keep voting for changes at the top, especially in the executive branch, until I see something I like. And Trump was able to tap into that bank much more readily than Hillary Clinton was able to tap into. I don't even really think she made a good case in the 2016 election that she represented change. If anything, she was kind of pitching continuity. It's not that people were utterly rejecting Obama, but people also want to see a little bit of change because change implies growth. And Trump was able to make that case. This time around, he's the incumbent. That's one argument that is harder for the incumbent to make, and I think is one of the biggest resources available for the challenger if they have the ability and the tools to make that case. I just think it's going to be a little bit harder for Biden, although he can pitch change as a return to normalcy. And there are some people who like the framing of great again. You know what I mean? Going back, moving backwards
going
a little
back.
bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I just go back to my view of things is when there's an incumbent, it's incumbent versus anti-incumbent. The only thing you can do as a challenger is do everything right that you have to do. Be charismatic, which, I don't know if there was a single person in the race that was like overwhelmingly Kennedy style, where you're going to win over a lot of new people. But act as if, make sure you're pointing out the issues that are wrong that you want to change. But thinking that it's
change is a matrix for the critique. Going back to what the challenger always has to focus on, everything is in service of the grander critique. So you're making a change narrative, but the reason you're making that change narrative is not just to speak to, this sounds nice, but the hopes and fears of people and their dreams or whatever. It's to serve as a critique of the person who's in office, to refocus your platform as a prism to critique the current incumbent. Why aren't they doing it? If these are good ideas, I like these ideas, how come that guy isn't doing it? And if that guy isn't going to do it, I'll put someone else in who will.
Yeah, and it's so you see like the choices we have, and I think that there's a lot of people you're hearing very upset that Elizabeth Warren isn't in the race. There's no woman in the race, and that's going to have an effect on Democrats, and they'll need to pick up that vote and make sure that that's available. So what you do have is three people now potentially. They're all older men. Geezer. It's like a geezer fest, It's like there's going to be gaffes. They're all kind of prone to saying things that are gaff. Joe Biden.
There are going to be health questions.
I mean, Joe Biden. This was the shocking thing I just learned is that so Neil Kinnock, who is the Labour Party leader in the UK, who made a speech that Joe Biden plagiarized essentially in 1988. Now, to be fair, he did credit it in other speeches, but in the Iowa affair, he didn't credit it that day, and he got nailed for it, and among other things he did. A lot of exaggerations, the same type of thing. There's nothing new there. I know there's a lot of critiquing of him and his mental fitness now, and it's kind of a meme going around. And I don't know. I think a lot of that's politics, but I will say that there's always been with him this gaffability, if you will. He just comes out with statements. I think it's a local politician. What was he, a running back? I think it was a running back in a high school football team. Always that kind of like, I know better than you. I can kind of get this. I already know where I'm going, and I know what I'm saying, and not taking the time to have people understand you all the time. I think he's a very confident person. I think all three people running have that level of confidence about their ideas. The better they can portray it, the better. But it is going to come down to a lot of like three people that, first of all, only some of the country like in each case. And then second of all, regardless of party really there. And then second of all, like all prone to gaffes. Nobody's a Reagan, nobody's a Kennedy kind of thing in terms of their speech making. They all have some controversies. They got parts of their party they have to take care of. It's going to be an interesting race any way it goes.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be an interesting and very competitive general election. I will say that as we go back to the Electoral College map, one of the big things that the Democrats have in their favor this time as kind of a zero risk and high reward place, especially down ballot, is Texas. And Texas has tightened up being defined as within 5 percentage points. So, to the point where the Republicans need to at least have an eye on playing some degree of defense, because right now so much of the Electoral College strategy is built around the idea that we're looking at Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida's the big guy, and we're focusing on that. Well, if you've got to play defense on Texas, and the Democrats have available Texas as an instant knockout, that does take a little bit more dexterous resource management, not by Donald Trump, but by Mitch McConnell and the Republican National Committee, and they'll have to be mindful of that.
Yeah, I do understand. I think that the whole idea of kind of like wasting your opponent's money in a state by kind of feinting it, I think that you saw it in 2004. So Cheney made a visit to Hawaii, and people were like, why are you going to Hawaii? And then to New Jersey, like, why is he going to New Jersey? What's he doing? And it really was an attempt, particularly the Hawaii trip, to get the Democrats to waste some of their money. But Kerry had real financial issues. He had signed up for the Federal Elections Commission money, so and there were limits so that he could spend. So he had to be real careful, and that really hurt his campaign throughout. I don't know anymore that you see those kind of limits. People are raising money on the internet. Trump's raised an awful lot of money.
Yeah, he's got good money.
Yeah.
That's not that problem. I'm talking more about the Republican National Committee. So it's essentially, this is a DNC versus RNC sort of strategy versus a Democratic nominee versus Trump strategy.
Okay, yeah, I get it. And it's certainly, believe me, you don't, on any level, you don't want those headlines if you're the GOP of that you're fighting for Texas. It's going to be tough for Democrats to do that in 2020, although all the demographics point towards a much tougher fight and certainly, like you say, knockout punch, because there's probably going to be an election in the future where Democrats have that. And it's simply like Trump winning Pennsylvania. It's like, well, we got nothing now. There's nothing that could counter that because we didn't plan on this, But I still think as much as there's down ticket effects, there's also up ticket effects in various elections. Truman benefited a lot from up ticket in 1948, and so did Wilson in 1916, where you have some popular down ticket people pushing the vote up, and Democrats not running because if they're focused on the down ticket race, they're going to get their candidate's going to get blown out in their particular county, whereas the other, sheriff, let's say, or whatever is a popular incumbent in that county is popular, bringing people out to vote. But the more important factor being the other side, their down ticket race is blown out unless you can nationally publicize that there really is a true fight on the presidential ticket. You're going to run into that factor, and even if Texas is viable, it won't be in that presidential election. I could see 2024. I also could see Arizona, a very narrow loss by Hillary Clinton there.
There's lots of evidence to suggest that the Democrats have a path forward in Arizona as well. And as I said, I think the benefit of Biden over Sanders, or an asset that Biden has available to him in his run that I don't think Sanders has to the same degree, is down ticket mobilization. I think you can run moderates in those districts and cobble together kind of a sneaky Biden win, especially in some of these battlegrounds.
Yeah, no, I think that that's exactly it. I mean, the down ticket wise, it would appear that it's a Sanders' riskier attempt. They're going to argue, of course, that we can bring out turnout everywhere, and there's people that don't vote that are going to vote. And I think, that's always an open question, but it's very difficult. That's when the
Joe
past
Cunningham
examples,
of South Carolina doesn't want to have to be defending Bernie Sanders' platform. Elise Slotkin, she's Michigan, right? Like these are people who are up for re-election in kind of tricky districts and don't want to have their debates in their districts be framed around the concept of socialism, or candidates running against them saying, Elise Slotkin's in favor of socialism. Joe Cunningham of South Carolina, like light blue South Carolina, is in favor of socialism. I think that is harder for those battleground districts to defend.
You got to look at suburbs and exurbs. So we talked earlier, the Democrats have their convention in Milwaukee. So we could say that they have their convention in Wisconsin this year, or we could say, just like the president's from Queens, he's not from New York City, he's from Queens, right? The convention's being held in Milwaukee, not Wisconsin. And that's one way to look at it. And I realize it's a little bit of a biased view there, but I think there's a lot of people that think that way. Wisconsin is a state, like many others, where people have left the city and gone to these, and sometimes left the suburb. And in those places where people have left the suburb, why? Because they can actually work outside. They either work in the suburb and are actually commuting to the suburb from the exurb, or they're doing the long way commuting to the city from the exurb. They're able to, they've actually left cities and in some ways have left like a stricter governance of things. And those are voters that are GOP voters. And that's a lot of what's happened in Wisconsin over the years, in addition to the disintegration of that kind of like farm prairie labor party that it's had. And not totally gone, but it's a factor. And I do think that whatever your ticket is, you have to think about it more broadly than just the two people or the three people potentially in the race, is to think about exurbs and what is it that they're thinking. And as a Democrat, you're not going to win exurbs. You're going to lose them, but you want to stop the bleeding and not lose by so much.
Yeah, you don't want to get blown out in the excerpts. And so that's where kind of skepticism of the incumbent, not necessarily loving the challenger, but skepticism of the incumbent either depressing votes to the point where people don't go out and vote, or are willing to pull the lever for a moderate like Joe Biden. I think that's the Biden path to victory.
And if you're Sanders, there's a way to do it, but I'm not hearing it. It's things like, why do I want health care? Right now, it's healthcare for all because of some type of right or some type of, this is what a society do. All great arguments. You and I would be wooed by that. I'm certain. A lot of people in New Jersey would be wooed by that. Not all. If you say, I want healthcare for everyone because you should be free to get whatever kind of job you want or start a business. And this base level thing is taken care of. So we can have more entrepreneurship in America and things like that. And that's the kind of arguments you have to start thinking about a little bit. I'm going to say quasi-libertarian, although that term always has dangerous connotations that I don't necessarily always mean, but a libertarian-like attitude.
It's increasing your freedom to go and get jobs. And I think that is something in the Sanders framing and also Warren's framing that was missing, is that a lot of times it's talking about it as a right, but a lot of voters, especially where you're talking about the suburbs and the exurbs, they're going to be more receptive to what liberties does this government expenditure afford me? It sounds kind of paradoxical because you're thinking I'm taxing to get a service and, rules and regulation and that sort of stuff. That's where the liberal mind goes to. But what you want to do, and the selling point is, I'm going to give you the freedom to leave the job that you don't like. You won't have to work, and this is my own life, you won't have to work at a non-standard auto insurance company to go and get the knee surgery that you need anymore because you've got health care employer through this system. I'm enhancing your liberty, your freedom, your mobility. And that argument's not there so far.
Yeah. Oh, not at all. We're not hearing that. And maybe he shifts during a general election campaign, but you get it away from the employer would be one. Get your health care away from employer. Stop this feudal system where your employer owns your health care. Like, there's arguments to be made.
Owns your health care. It's even more than your employer, because sometimes people like the company, but most people, as they always say, you don't work for your job, Bruce, you work for your boss. Use the framing of where your boss no longer dictates whether or not you have health care, which is a very real dynamic that everyone's been through. You have a crappy boss, but you have a job that you need, and your life and your livelihood at that particular moment depends on somebody you don't like or respect very much. The idea of liberating people from that scenario, super appealing.
And another thought, I just go back to, I think probably Warren should have stayed in the race, try to split the convention up and get whatever demands. Or
people
possibly
forget how contested conventions have been through the years. I don't want to get you into a freewheeling mode of that, but I mean, in some conventions, there were over 40 rounds of voting.
Yeah. Lincoln, for instance, had a bunch. And a lot of questions that are still modern questions come up, like Lincoln was hounded over. Why are you getting delegates from Virginia are voting for Lincoln in the convention when they'll never be able to vote in a general election? So you're getting this false votes that will never be able to carry when it comes to the 1860 election. That issue was debated in the Republican convention in Chicago in 1860. We think all these things are just modern debates, So yeah, I mean, absolutely. With Warren, the thought that I have is that it's the danger of electability. Electability is a curse. It's the same as the stock market not being the economy. It's just what a bunch of people who want to make money think the economy's gonna be, predict that the economy is gonna be. Electability is the same way. It's not real electability. It's just what people think electability is. Voters have been saying since 1969 that they would accept a woman president. Several other countries, including a fairly conservative, socially conservative UK, have accepted women leaders. And yet it's all this curse of electability. Well, we're not going to be able to win, so we're not going to do it. That really counters the question. And I know in 2016 that we did see a major party candidate as a woman, but I think,
Now, here's my problem with electability, the way that it gets used in the national media discussion and the national political discussion, is it goes back to really the first hour of this conversation. When you and I are talking about the contours of the general election, a lot of it is how does a candidate adapt to dynamic changes of events, sudden shifts, sudden reactions, because that actually has as much of an effect in the election as it does in terms of governance. I think that's a much more useful matrix. And a lot of times we talk about electability as, well, based on the election results that we've seen in New Hampshire and Iowa and battleground states in the past, how will these candidates fare? I think it misunderstands the way the general election actually plays out. It's looking at the results and forgetting about how you get to those results. Oh,
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. How does a candidate react to things? How do they come off? How do they handle questions? Do they act as if? That's something that's going to be determined. That's why it's very difficult. That's why electability is terrible. And even the arguments, it's hard to referee and decide for ourselves, I think, at times, who those electability arguments, because there could be a thought that, like, yeah, Joe Biden gets in. And like I said earlier, you could have a scenario here where it's like, oh, once you switch the pitcher from Hillary Clinton to Joe Biden, you just get back to blue states and then, Democrats win the election. That Trump was just a temporary fluke thing that happened because of several events, but most notably, like, there was some antipathy towards Clinton and maybe a few people because it was so lopsided. The polls were so lopsided that maybe people didn't show up and things like that. So I don't know that I agree with that, but that's a
I have a
plausible
theory
scenario.
that some people watched the debates and assumed that it was so one-sided because we sort of overweight the debates in our mind. And, I think that the debates and Trump's performance in the debates, especially the perception among the Democratic electorate, led people to believe, okay, Hillary Clinton's going to kind of walk this. But I also agree that there's some kind of fundamental... again, borne out by just the sustaining polling that we saw throughout that election cycle, there was some fundamental dislike of Hillary Clinton that she was never able to fully surmount.
Highest amount of write-in votes ever in a presidential election. She certainly had some feeling that the high poll numbers on both for I'm voting for this person, but I don't like this person. On both sides, very high. A little bit, I believe a little bit more in the exit polls for Trump of that, where it's just kind of your standard Republicans. Like I'm thinking a lot of towns in New Jersey, even though the state didn't go for Trump, there are a lot of towns that are fairly suburban, fairly not rabid, kind of ultra Republican towns that we just went for Trump. I'm sure a lot of those people are just like, he is the nominee of my party. That's what I'm voting for, kind of thing. And not even factoring in, do I agree with every action? That's not on the ballot. I don't have a half choice on the ballot. I only have one choice. But we did see people take outs like Gary Johnson and write-in significant numbers. So what's that instructive to me is that, authenticity is real. You got to be real. You got to be Biden does better when he's the underdog. If he tries to keep that up, not get all like I'm the front runner now and, just be a little humble. And also he has to be real because he is what he is. It ain't going to work if he tries to polish because that play is not available for him.
He's needs always to get a good VP that he can lean on to do a lot of speaking for him. And Joe can be the figurehead and not have to talk too much. Just to go back to the 2008 example, if there's a financial crisis, it will be a race between Donald Trump and Joe Biden as to who says the most inarticulate thing about that massive financial event. And I think Joe Biden can make that race in his favor if he selects somebody, Kamala Harris, who you can put out and trust that Kamala Harris, I'm just using her as an example, is going to go out there and say things that are not going to embarrass you and probably are going to be more articulate. Plus, you can kind of run this race as Harris it actually puts Trump in an uncomfortable position where you have the VP nominee constantly attacking the incumbent. It allows Trump to be in a weird place where he has to kind of punch down on the ticket and Biden can keep himself on the sidelines.
That's a great point. That could totally happen, and that could totally be something that needs to happen. Because
I think it's his best play. I'm not even saying like he needs to do this. This is the cagiest, best political strategy move. But being real with who Joe Biden is and who we've seen Joe Biden to be throughout this campaign, because there are more recent, I would say, campaign and primary inspired questions about Joe Biden's mental sharpness that are being made by political opponents in upcoming primaries, right? But then we've also seen throughout 2018, at the tail end of 2018, he did an interview with Craig Melvin shortly after the Kavanaugh hearings that didn't go very well, where he's talking about Anita Hill. After that, we heard about Corn Pop and how he was a bad dude, and then we heard more from that same speech where he's talking about his leg hair dangling in a pool. Like, these are not mental images.
I know.
Yeah, going back to your Jimmy Carter, I have lust in my heart. If you're saying that, you're losing.
Yep. There's no JFK in 2020.
This is why I think he needs that VP. This is why he needs a Kamala Harris or someone to really be more of the focus and the rock star energy.
Harris, I go back to my old cigar smoking convention days, but I'm like, we don't need California. You don't need California.
I agree with that too. She's not like my number one politician.
Leaving that middle of the country open. You're leaving the Midwest, which is exactly the problem, open, right? So you look at Klobuchar, maybe there's someone else. He doesn't have to.
I think Biden needs to go to where the turnout's been for him, though. And what you saw in South Carolina, I think, suggests that someone like a Stacey Abrams, Kamala Harris in Florida, if you're looking at a Florida strategy, and Andrew Gillum, that might be where Joe Biden needs to go.
Chris Novembrino, I think this has been a great one.
This is great fun. Thank you for having me on.
Well, I'll have you on. Feel free to run it on both channels, of course. And everybody go to don'tworry.tv, where you can get the Don't Worry About the Government podcast, and it features none other than Mr. Chris Novembrino. Chris, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much. We're celebrating episode 450. This will be episode 451. What an exciting time. Thank you, Bruce.
Oh man, I got to step in there and just one more thought. Now you're knowing what it's like to be a long-term podcaster, huh?
I'm actually. It feels like I finally stepped through that door. There's a point, and you would have thought maybe it would have switched on at like episode 300 or episode 400. But I've now been like pitching the show to other people and having to say things like the show's been running since the late days of the Bush administration before Barack Obama became president, and now I feel old. Like I mean, not like old, but like, oh man, I guess I have been doing this quite a long time.
Yeah, that's how it is. That's how it is, Great. Well, thanks for coming on. And I thank all of you for listening. My website is www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. Thanks so much.